Hello everyone, my name is John, I'm the Geeky Fanboy, and welcome back to me talking about books. Today we are doing our monthly wrap-up. I'm talking about all the books I read in April. It was quite a productive reading month for me this time. I read um, around 14 books, 6 of which were actual novels, and the rest was like manga, comic books, stuff like that. So I'm here today to just go through some of those books I've read and tell you a bit about them. As some of you may know from watching my other videos, I do live in Germany, so for some of these books I will hold up the German edition of those books because those are the books I have available at the moment, so don't be surprised by that. First things first, this was quite an Avatar heavy month for me yet again. So I start off the month with reading the Kyoshi novels. So we have The Rise of Kyoshi and The Shadow of Koshi. So these are, so to speak, prequel novels to the Avatar: The Last Airbender cartoon series, and these books cover basically the beginnings or the origin stories of Avatar Kyoshi, who was, as we all know, if you watched the show, the Earthbender Avatar before Aang. I was quite excited to get into these books because I've been meaning to read them forever, but haven't really gotten around to doing so. But I was also a little bit nervous because, you know, I love the cartoon and the world so much, so I was nervous if these books can live up to the hype, so to speak, and if they're still as interesting to me, and if this world is still as interesting to me in novel form compared to watching the cartoon. So, what did I think of these books? Quite good, actually. Let's talk about the first one. The first one is The Rise of Kyoshi. And this book really starts day one when Kyoshi finds out that she's the Avatar. And what I love about this book, the general premise of this book, is that in the beginning, Kyoshi doesn't even know that she's the Avatar because everyone assumes someone else is the Avatar. So they have a completely different person who they think is the Avatar, and no one suspects that Kyoshi is actually that person. So I think that's a really, really interesting premise to start off with. Even though in the beginning you're sort of kind of just waiting for the reveal to happen because you're like, okay, yeah, but we know it's gonna be Kyoshi, so you're just kind of waiting a bit for that. And the story that continues from there, I honestly thought was really, really interesting. So it's about politics and crime in the Earth Kingdom, because there are some gangs that are roaming around the country, and at the same time there are former friends or coaches of the Avatar basically who turn more or less bad, and Kyoshi basically has to deal with those consequences that come from that, especially after it is revealed that she's actually the Avatar, not that one other person who everyone thought it was. So Kyoshi has to think about, okay, how can I stop this one particular person, but also how do I want to deal with the gangs and the crimes that are going on in the Earth Kingdom. And then she's sort of forced to unite with a gang of criminals. And I don't even want to say too much because I honestly thought this book was really, really, really fun. So I ended up giving this a 4.25, I think, because I honestly thought it was so much fun to go into the world of Avatar, but in a written form. You could really tell that the writer, FCE, was working together with one of the makers of the show, together with Michael Dante DiMartino, and you could really imagine how everything looked and worked from the cartoon. But I think the book also really adds to some stuff of the world that you didn't know of before, like some of the people who the Avatar was friends with, also some forms of bending that are being discovered. And I honestly thought this was quite a fun adventure that explored some interesting aspects, especially of Kyoshi's character, because Kyoshi isn't, she's tough, but also really soft on the inside, and I thought it was really interesting to see how she comes to terms with being the Avatar, and to have to see her struggle, especially also with her bending, because Kyoshi starts out basically being really bad at bending, even at earth bending. So it was fun to see how she develops from there. even though I would argue some of the bending progress she makes within this book are a bit too much, a bit too fast, personally speaking. But it was still interesting to see how she deals with the problems that are being given to her. And also, there is even a bit of a romance in this book. It's just as I preferred, secondary to the major plot line. It only really gets some highlights throughout the book, but it's still very, very sweet. Basically confirms Kyoshi as a chaotic bisexual as she falls in love with a firebending girl who she has been friends with for many, many years, and it was really sweet to see that relationship form throughout the book. So yes, the first one, a lot of fun, so I was all the more excited to get into the second one, The Shadow of Kyoshi. This one was also good, but not as good as the first one. So I ended up giving the second novel 3.75 stars, because while this was interesting, I thought this was a lot more convoluted and unnecessarily complex compared to the first one. Whereas the first one was mostly like a straight up adventure that had many interesting elements, but maybe like one or two moments where I thought that didn't really fit the story that well, but was still mostly entertaining. This one is kind of confusing. Like I didn't really understand or grasp the entire like red thread or the major focus point this book was trying to tell me about. So the second one is a lot more about the Fire Nation politics, and Fire Nation traditions, because there are people within the Fire Nation and Fire Nation royalty who want to overthrow the clans or the families of the Fire Nation. At the same time, we're still dealing with some previous antagonists from the first book, but it all had a bit of trouble, coming together properly. So for a large part of this novel, I was sort of not really confused, but I felt like I didn't really have a full grasp of what the story was trying to be. And while I do think some of the new characters that are introduced in the second novel are interesting, they're never really as interesting or as detailed as the group of criminals from the first book that Kyoshi befriends. But I do think there are some interesting elements that are brought to the second novel. Like I said, it's mostly about the Fire Nation, so we get some interesting elements as to what Fire Nation culture is like, especially Fire Nation etiquette, because Kyoshi has to like go and talk to the Fire Lord, and she gets like so many lessons about how she has to behave, and of course she's not that good at it. So that was quite interesting. We get many new forms of bending that I thought were really interesting. For example, in this one, it's confirmed that glass bending is possible. It's a form of earth bending. I thought that was really cool. Some other sides of healing, of water bending, are explored in this as well. So there are some good elements to all of this, but it was dragged down by a convoluted plot, also by including some elements regarding previous Avatar lore that I thought didn't really work, because in this we get a lot of background on Avatar Kuruk, so on the waterbending avatar that preceded Kyoshi. And I thought it was a bit weird that with all the new stuff we find out about Kuruk in this book, what never got mentioned was any of the background we know about Kuruk from the actual cartoon. So in this, he talks a lot about, how he fought the spirits and why. But what is never mentioned is that stuff that Kuruk mentioned to Aang in the cartoon, that, he was living in a relatively peaceful time, that he met the love of his life, that she was madly in love with him, but then her face was stolen by the face stealer spirit. None of that gets mentioned in this book, which is really weird, which almost feels a bit like, okay, did the book just forget about it? Did the author ignore that? Are they doing a retcon? I don't know. It felt a bit weird. So, yeah, while this was still entertaining, I didn't think it was as good as the first novel. I still plan on making a video in the future where I talk about all the Avatar novels once I've read some of the other ones, the Yang Chen novels, and also the Avatar Roku book that's gonna come out soon. But yeah, for now, I had a lot of fun with these books, and I would definitely recommend them to fans of the show. the next book I read received an overly long review on this channel. Namely, I read The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. Like I mentioned, a book I read for my video series about me reading popular TikTok books to see if they're any good. Serpent and the Wings of Night, while not good, was not as horrible as I had suspected. I ended up giving it 2 out of 5 stars, which obviously doesn't mean it's great, but it also doesn't mean it's utter garbage. Like, I thought it had 1 or 2 elements where I could see, okay, I understand why someone would really be into that. However, the overall story was way too long and took way too many influences from stuff like the Hunger Games, while trying to be a sort of like vampire political thriller adventure thing, but didn't really do it well because the world building doesn't add up, and of course all the stuff is overshadowed by the romance yet again, which, to be fair, the romance wasn't totally horrible in this book, but none of the characters really had all that much detail to them. But yeah, just go watch the video if you want to hear my in-depth thoughts on this. Would I recommend this? Not necessarily, but if you're like a fan of romantasy, I would at least say this one is worth checking out if you want something relatively like light-hearted, in the sense of you can sort of like switch your brain off and maybe have some fun with it. The next book I finished in April was another reread. I finally finished my reread of Lord of the Rings by finishing Return of the King. So that's my Lord of the Rings reread done. I listened to large parts of it via audiobook, which was so much fun and really made me appreciate the language even more just by listening to it and sort of really engulfing myself in the sounds of the language. I love Lord of the Rings so much. It really is one of the best fantasy series ever written, arguably one of the best book series, just in general, ever written. And Return of the King might low-key be my favorite. I'm not sure, like Return of the King is kind of my favorite movie in the trilogy, because I feel like so much epic and memorable and heartfelt stuff just happens in this last novel. And I was honestly lost for words at the end of it. Like I said, I have read this before. This was a reread, but the last time I read these books was like 6-7 years ago or something like that. So it was really fun to get back into the world of Middle Earth, to just feel how much love and attention to detail Tolkien has put into the creation of this world, to the creation of these characters. There are really some moments in there, especially towards the end, that really make you emotional, make you, if you're like me, maybe even cry a bit. This was probably the most emotional epilogue ever, which is basically just like, there was like a list of facts, basically, about stuff that happens after the story is over, and it's just like a list of events, but they honestly made me really emotional, because I was like, I've spent so much time with these characters and now they're finally having a life, they get to chill out and have fun and be themselves, and it's just good. It's good. So yeah, I can't even say that much, because it's good. It's Lord of the Rings, for God's sake. I wrote a review for each book on my Goodreads and my Storygraph. If you want to check that out, maybe in the future I'm gonna make a video on these books, because I think there's so much you can say about these. And honestly, if you haven't read this one yet, then what are you doing? Go and read Lord of the Rings. It's amazing. So yes, 5 out of 5. Return of the King was bloody brilliant. Next up, we have more Avatar: The Last Airbender stuff, starting off with a companion book, namely Legacy of the Fire Nation. So this is a companion book which is written as a sort of compilation of Iroh's notes, diary entries, thoughts and opinions on not just the story of Avatar, but especially like the Fire Nation itself, its culture and its history. And this compilation is basically being presented as a book that Iroh is compiling for Zuko to give to him when he becomes the Fire Lord, so he has a better understanding of his legacy and the legacy of the Fire Nation. So this very much is just like a companion novel It includes a lot of stuff that we already know about, like, Zuko's Zuko's family history, who his dad is, where they come from, some of the previous Fire Lords like Sozin and Zulon, some of that stuff as well. But what makes it more interesting is that it's told from Iroh's point of view, so he's giving some inputs or some opinions on things that we maybe hadn't considered before. He also, like Iroh, also talks a bit about himself and his own relationship with the Fire Nation, especially also his relationship with the royal family and his brother. There are also some mentions about, what would have happened if he had maybe potentially become the Fire Lord, which I thought was quite interesting. So there are a lot of like neat details in here, and it's also filled with like a lot of emotion, because Iroh is of course addressing Zuko throughout this and mentions some of the stuff they've gone through together that we know from the cartoon. And it really makes you smile, because Iroh is like so positively minded and always wants to support Zuko. And occasionally you get like some extra bits in this, like letters or notes, like from Iroh or from Zuko to Iroh. And they're really, really adorable. Like, for example, there is a letter here from like Zuko, 7 years old or something, who's writing to Iroh while Iroh was stationed near Ba Sing Se during the war. And you're like, oh god, this is causing so many different emotions. And you also have some input on some of the events of the cartoon from Iroh's point of view, and on some of the characters. For example, Iroh highlights every major member of the gang and talks about them, what he thinks about them, also in their relation to Zuko and the Fire Nation. So yes, there are some neat bits in here. There's also some extra stuff in here, like, extra illustrations that we maybe haven't seen yet. There are maps in here as well, or like little photographs or something. So there's always like something you can look at. It also dives in, like goes into some stuff that happens after the cartoon. So we know from like the comics or Legend of Korra as well. I think Korra even gets mentioned as well towards the end of the book. Like she writes, so like Korra also writes to Uncle Iroh. So I like the Legend of Korra isn't ignored here as well. So yeah, this was honestly a really neat addition to the cartoon, to Avatar Last Airbender, and also to Legend of Korra. Sure, this isn't a proper book, but I still end up giving it 5 out of 5. I love this world, I love this cartoon, and this was honestly a really, really interesting and sweet addition to this universe. And as someone who is I'm gonna say hashtag honorary member of the Firebending Nation, I thought this was really, really cute, and I can recommend this to anyone who's a fan of the show. Speaking of the show, we got more stuff. I read one of the other Avatar Last Airbender comics, namely The Promise. So The Promise is the first comic that takes place after the cartoon series. You might remember from a previous monthly wrap-up that I've actually read The Search before, which is basically the second novel. So I read these in the wrong order, but it honestly doesn't matter all that much. They're mostly like stories that are like one-off and then move on. Most of them, like some elements, like 1 or 2 elements, do get mentioned that happened in previous comics. So this is the one that takes place just like, I think like a couple of months and a year after the events of the cartoon. It very much highlights Zuko's struggle with becoming the new Fire Lord and dealing with some political issues that now have to be resolved after the 100-year war is over. And also his relationship with Aang, because they're both playing this important role in the restructuring of this world, and Zuko very much is worried about becoming like his father, that he will at some point go off the deep end, and he makes Aang promise that he should kill Zuko if Zuko ever becomes like his father. And Aang, who of course very much troubled with not only violence but taking a life, struggles with this, because at first he agrees to it, but of course doesn't want to. So there is the struggle for both of these boys, especially as the story continues, because it is about the firebenders, which colonized parts of the Earth Kingdom many, many, many years ago and have lived there now for generations. And now the restoration movement says that, okay, we're taking all the firebenders back from the Earth Kingdom and give the Earth Kingdom back to its people, meaning we're basically going to take all of these people out of that place, even though they've lived there for generations and have also kind of become members of the Earth Kingdom and have formed new cultures. So very much plays with these sort of gray zones where they're like, yes, they have once conquered this part of the nation, but also over the years they have come to live with the Earth Kingdom citizens there, and they've sort of formed their own little community. So they're like different sides, of course, to this conflict, and Zuko is very much struggling with this, because at first he's like, yes, we should do that because the Fire Nation is like all evil and what we did was bad, so we have to take all of them out. But then he's like, is that really the right decision? And then he like sort of goes back and forth on his decision, and Aang just tries to deal with it as best he can, but also doesn't want to get pushed to that point where he feels like he has to fight Zuko. So I thought that was a lot of interesting stuff going on, especially much more mature themes that deal with like political issues, but also personal issues, especially in regards to Zuko. While I thought some of the character moments or developments in this seemed a little out of character at times, I thought most of these were well explained by the end of the story, even though I felt like some of these elements could have been dealt with a little bit better. Some of the characters also don't get as many highlights as others. For example, Toph and Sokka are mostly completely sidelined for large parts of the story and have their own little secondary storyline going on that doesn't really have to do anything with like the major conflict that's going on between Zuko and Aang. So that was a little disappointing. But overall, I had a lot of fun with this. I thought it was very interesting that the story like directly picks up issues and themes that were hinted at from like in the original cartoon, but now addresses them fully and isn't afraid to be like, hey, we know you like these characters, but there are still some issues they deal with. Zuko hasn't completed his character arc yet. There's still some stuff he's struggling with, and I thought that was really, really interesting. So if you're a fan of the show and maybe have thought about maybe reading the comic books, but you weren't sure, definitely get into them. I've now read 2 of them, 1 and 2. I really enjoyed both of them. I got the 3rd one ready to read as well, so you're probably going to hear about that in the next monthly wrap-up, and I might even plan on making a video about, you know, if the Avatar comics are any good. But for now, I can definitely say, if you're a fan of the show, go check out the comics. Next up, we have a very rare case of DNF on our hands. So I very rarely, almost never DNF books. I try to get through all of them because I want to give the author a chance. I want to give the story a chance. I'm thinking maybe something good is gonna happen later. So I usually try to struggle through books, but with this one, I couldn't. It's Sons of Darkness by Gaurav Mohanty. I picked this one up months ago based on, well, the cover looks amazing. Look at this. And based on the premise, because this is a dark high fantasy novel set in India based on Indian mythology. And I thought that was such a cool premise because I think fantasy needs more stories like this that are inspired by non-Western cultures and mythologies. So I really, really wanted to get into it, but I couldn't. I got into this about 20%, which were like, I think, around page 170 or something is where I think I stopped reading this. Because I just couldn't get into this. This book is so overstuffed in its writing that I really had no idea what was going on. By the time I finished this, or stopped basically, I had no idea what was going on. I could not tell you what was going on. It has a bunch of different characters that I had no idea about what they were actually doing or where they were. Like, sure, some of them get explained like in the back of the book, but you know what the thing is? I met like 2 or 3 of the 5 or 6 main characters after reading almost 200 pages. By the time I stopped, I hadn't even met all of the main characters yet, and I was almost 200 pages in. And I just couldn't get on with it. This book is trying way too hard to be like Game of Thrones on purpose, because the author mentions in the author note in the beginning that he's very much inspired by George R. R. Martin and stories like Game of Thrones. And you could tell, because this has a lot of this, dark high fantasy stuff where it's like, ooh, politics, and we're trying to be very overly complex, even though you have no idea what's all of this stuff actually is. And for some reason, we feel the need to include a lot of violence and sex, especially in regards to women, and we're sexist and violent towards women because grim, dark fantasy be like that, and the story is historically accurate, and you're like, I don't need this. I don't need this. You're not writing a history book, you're writing a fantasy book. Do we really need all this unnecessary violence and awkwardness? Horrible awkwardness towards all the female characters in this book that I've met so far? Because I don't need that. Especially if it's not contextualized whatsoever within the story, but rather feels like, oh, we're doing this because this is what every grim high fantasy book does. And you're like, that's a cheap excuse. I'm not doing that. And the way this is written, it has a lot of purple prose that stuffs a lot of stuff into basically like a short amount of time, so much so that I had no idea where stuff even happened, who people were talking about. Like, characters are being introduced every second paragraph. Like, places get mentioned, political moves get mentioned, issues, themes, and I just lost track. This is why I basically had no idea what this story was about. So I didn't rate this because, like I said, I DNF'd it after like 20%. Maybe check out a summary online, see if it interests you. I want to say that I'll get back to this at some point. Maybe it also just wasn't the right moment for me to pick this up. Who knows? Like I said, I do like the general premise and the idea of, a fantasy story based on Indian mythology and culture. I think we really do need more books like this, but I honestly just couldn't with this book, and I didn't want to force myself to read more than 600 pages of this if I didn't even have any idea of what was going on. So yeah, that's unfortunately DNF for me. For yourself, maybe check out a summary to see if it interests you. Otherwise, yeah, this is a no for me. Next up, I read the 4th volume in the Hellblazer Dead in America series. So I've been following this series very closely ever since it came out in the beginning of this year, and I've been having so much fun with this series. And the thing is, I keep saying almost every time there's a new issue, I keep saying, oh, this is the best one so far. And you know what I'm going to say about this one? This 4th issue is the best one so far in this series, like, by a long shot. I've been having so much fun with this series, and this issue is like the perfect example of why I love the Hellblazer series. This is like classic John Constantine supernatural shenanigans. Like, he is conning people, he's dressing up as a hot priest and tries to just like infiltrate this little town, tries to find out what's going on, while also roping in Noah, his son, into his plans. And honestly, I'm just having so much fun following this series, which is about, John trying to get back, his heart, trying to get healthy again, basically, but the Sandman gets involved, and he also needs to contact Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing in this series looks a lot of fun because large parts of this story are set in the desert. So Swamp Thing is made up of all like cacti and dry plants, which make him look really, really interesting, I think. And I honestly just love how this series manages to hit all the right notes that I love about Hellblazer. It has an interesting story with a supernatural background, includes many complex themes, especially on the political side of things. There's so much interesting political commentary, not just in previous issues, but also in this one as well. And it's just John being his classic conniving con man son of a bitch that I love, like the elements that I love so much about his character, and I'm just having a lot of fun. So if, like me, you are a fan of the Hellblazer series and maybe weren't sure yet if you want to check the series out, definitely do it. It's like Simon Spurrier and co are definitely on a high note again with this series, and I honestly can't wait to see where this one is going next. Next up, let's talk about some manga. I read volumes 3 and 4 of Brutal Confessions of a Homicide Investigator. This is, first off, warning, you definitely need to be 18 and or above to read this. And second off, this is more of a guilty pleasure series for me, honestly, because this series is essentially a very violent revenge fantasy. So this manga series is about a man who is a homicide investigator at the Japan police, and via his job he comes into contact with really, really horrible people who commit horrible things, but no one, for various reasons, is able to stop them, or no one knows that they are the ones committing these crimes. And then our homicide investigator basically finds these people and tortures and eventually murders them in very, very colorful and violent fashion. So you have some emotional satisfaction, basically. That's honestly the entire shtick of this series. There isn't like an overarching major story for this series. There are some character plot beats that get hit for like occasionally for the main character, especially in volumes 3 and 4. There's some stuff teased for future volumes that might address some of the main characters' past, but most of the time these mangas honestly include just 2 or 3 mini arcs about a particular horrible person who commits a horrible crime or is some kind of really, really horrible wanker, and then we just wait for them to get horribly murdered and be like, yes, you deserve that. That's it. Honestly, that's it. I'm not saying this is great. I think so far I've given each volume of this series 3 stars, but I don't know. I'm sort of enjoying the main premise of this. It maybe just scratches a particular itch. So I don't know. If you don't mind the gore, if you don't mind the heavy themes, definitely check out some content warnings for this series before you go into it. This is a series where you can just sort of like a super violent true crime show. You can just sort of turn your brain off despite all the awfulness is happening, just sort of get on with what's happening, then get some satisfaction out of the revenge that's executed in this series. Next up, more manga, a series I was really excited about because I finally finished my favorite manga series. I finally was able to finish Requiem of the Rose King. I've been meaning to finish this series for ages, but for some reason I could never find the last 3 volumes in any of the bookshops in my town. And finally, a couple of weeks ago, I went to the comic book shop hoping they would have this series, and lo and behold, they did. So I picked up the 3 volumes I was still missing in this series, and I read all of them back to back so I could finally finish this series. And what can I tell you? I love this series. So for those who don't know, Requiem of the Rose King is a dark fantasy historical manga series based on the historical plays by William Shakespeare, which are about the Wars of the Roses. So this one focuses on the character of Richard III, who in this version is intersexual. So this is how this body deformity, which he usually has in the Shakespeare play, is sort of explored in this series. How that Richard struggles with gender and gender roles and family issues, all of course while the story of the Wars of the Roses is happening around him. So this story covers, of course, multiple years, multiple battles, multiple wars, multiple storylines that don't only concern himself, but also many political issues and family issues surrounding him. And finally, it all comes to a head in these last 3 volumes, ending with volume 17. And of course, I don't want to say too much because it's the ending of the series. And even though you might think, like me, you know where this is going because, you know, you're familiar with the Wars of the Roses and or you're familiar with the Shakespeare play, there are still 1 or 2 surprises thrown in here that keep you on the edge of your seat because you're maybe not entirely sure where this is going after all. I do plan on maybe making a video about this series, telling you a bit more about why it's my favorite manga series that I've read. There is also an anime adaptation based on this, which I stopped watching after 3 or 4 episodes because I honestly did not like it at all. So please do read the manga, don't watch the anime. The art style of this is utterly beautiful. I love the paneling. I love how this mangaka is able to convey Richard's feelings just like in one drawing of the character where you can immediately tell what his struggles are. And just I'm absolutely I'm happy. I'm happy with how the series ended. I'm happy I was finally able to finish it. Ratings 15 and 16, like volume 15 and 16, they both got like 4 stars from me. The last one got a 4.5 because I honestly thought it was a mostly satisfying ending. It has 1 or 2 surprises in there as well. It was a little too wrapped up too quickly for my liking, but still overall had a lot of fun with it. I'm happy with the ending. I was delighted to be finally able to finish this. And if you're on the lookout for a new manga series, go check out Requiem of the Rose King. And last, but by no means least, we have another reread, namely Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Now, you've heard me talk about Neil Gaiman before. Neil Gaiman is my absolute favorite contemporary writer, and Neverwhere is my favorite book by Neil Gaiman. So Neverwhere is generally the answer I give when someone asks me for what my favorite book is. I usually say this one. And I thought it was finally time for a reread. I once again listened to large parts of this via audiobook, which is also narrated by Neil Gaiman, who I honestly think is a fantastic audiobook narrator. I already listened to The Graveyard Book, read by him, which was also a lot of fun. So this book is one of Neil Gaiman's earliest works. This was actually his first ever solo novel that he wrote. So Good Omens, of course, he wrote together with Terry Pratchett, as we know, and this one was his first own project, bigger project, so to speak, which was written parallel running to the Neverwhere TV show that was also released in the 90s. So this isn't based on the show, so to speak, because the book and the show came out at the same time. So Neil Gaiman was working on the show, was writing the show, but at the same time also wrote a book with the same story. And when there was stuff for the TV show that didn't have enough space to be there, they didn't have much time, he would be like, oh, we cut it out of the TV show, but I'm going to put it in the book. So basically these 2 things sort of exist at the same time. So what's Neverwhere about? Neverwhere is an urban fantasy story about a young Scotsman, Richard Mayhew, who moves to London, and there he lives a relatively normal life, works at an office, has a very pretty fiancée who is a bit, you know, a lot of work, but he loves her, he has his own place, he's a bit of a shy, quiet boy. And one day, while out with his fiancée, he comes upon a young woman named Dor, and she's injured, and Richard decides to help her and takes her home and takes care of her and makes sure she doesn't die. And she's very thankful for that, but once she leaves, Richard realizes that things have changed about his life. Like suddenly, people don't recognize him anymore, he gets thrown out of his office, people stop listening to him, they don't hear him at all, it's like he isn't even really there. Like people are purposefully ignoring him, and Richard tries to find out what the hell this girl had to do with it. And he eventually ends up in London Below, which is essentially a parallel world that lies, as the name says, below London. Like in the tube tunnels, essentially, of London, in the sewers of London. And it's described as this world where you end up, where people end up who slip between the cracks. Like a lot, for example, homeless people. Like homelessness is a big theme of this story. And Richard goes on an adventure in London Below, trying to find Dor and trying to not only get his life back, but also trying to help Dor figure out what happened to her family, who was horribly murdered. By who? We don't know. So they go on essentially like a D&D-esque quest in London Below, talk to a lot of different and wacky people, meet a bunch of like London referenced things. Like if you live in London or are familiar with London, geography of London, there are a lot of like in-jokes in this, especially in the naming of things. So there are a lot of different elements in this that they encounter. I just love this book. I honestly do. I just love the wackiness of it all. I always loved Neil Gaiman's sense of humor and sense of fantasy, because Neil Gaiman never writes, he doesn't write like straight up fantasy, you know, never like Lord of the Rings-esque fantasy. He's much more subtle in his fantasy. This is more like urban fantasy, which is most of the stuff he writes. It's much more a touch of the supernatural, magical realism, all that. Like this very much feels like a world that could exist parallel to our own. And I just love the adventure of it all. I'm generally a fan of fantasy stories that just do a fun adventure with a relatable protagonist who ends up changing across the progress of the story, and he just meets a bunch of wacky, interesting characters, and they go on a bunch of quests in order to find out about something. Obviously, spoilers, I don't want to say too much. I just love shit like that, especially because all the people Richard hangs out with in this book, they're so interesting. So, of course, we have Richard himself, who is our protagonist, who's sort of this reluctant hero who learns to, like, he stays a shy and introverted boy, but he also learns how to sort of assert himself. He goes from being very silent and submissive to being able to like open his mouth and say his opinion when he wants to. Dor is this interesting young woman who has this ability to open doors wherever she wants, and she's a member of this seemingly like very high culture, almost royal kind of family in London Below, but her family ends up getting murdered. She's the only one surviving, and now she's trying to find out who the hell did this to her family while not trying to get murdered herself. They hang out with a mysterious character called the Marquis de Carabas, who's arguably the most interesting character in this entire book, who's sort of like this very mysterious, charismatic, Jack Sparrow-esque almost kind of character who is always scheming in the background. You always know there's something he's thinking about, and his motives are never entirely clear. So throughout the entire novel, you're sort of wondering about what his actual plans are, what his actual motivation is, and if you can trust him or not. Then we also have Hunter, who becomes Dor's bodyguard, and she's like this really badass, legendary hunter who's killed many different legendary creatures in other cities, and now she's finally returned to London Below to kill the Beast of London. But at the same time, there may be also some other stuff going on, like she has a mysterious past that we don't quite know about because she's been gone for so many years, and now she ends up returning and helping out Dor. So we have so many different characters that are really, really interesting in this book. Those are like only the major 4 characters that we follow throughout the book, but there's so many more other interesting figures that are all written with so much attention to detail, just as the rest of this book is, because Neil Gaiman is honestly really, really amazing at world building. Like, it always manages to introduce new elements at the right point in time, especially because Richard is the perfect kind of character, because he doesn't know anything about London Below. He's there for the first time, so we're discovering London Below alongside with him, while at the same time we're occasionally switching POVs to other characters like Dor or the Marquis, people who know more about the world. So through them we discover other parts of this world that we otherwise wouldn't have seen at all with Richard, who doesn't know anything about this world. So this really feels like an alive and very illustrious world where you feel like there isn't just the stuff going on that we see in the book, but you feel like there's even more going on somewhere in the background that you could even read a second book about. And I know Neil Gaiman has been working on a sequel for this for years. When are we finally getting this sequel, Neil? I know we all love Good Omens, the TV show, but work on this sequel, please. I need it. So yeah, if you're a fan of Neil Gaiman and maybe haven't read this one yet, definitely go check it out. And just in general, if you're a fan of fun, slightly wacky, interesting, supernatural fantasy stories, please go and check out Neverwhere. So that's it for the monthly wrap-up for the month of April. Lots of fun, interesting books in this one. Bunch of comics, bunch of Avatar Last Airbender stuff that I was very excited about. So yeah, good reading month for me. Only one DNF, which is a very, very rare case. But, I mean, occasionally, sometimes a bad one slips in there. But overall, I had a lot of fun with all the books I read in April. And if you have any thoughts and opinions on the books or comics or manga I presented to you in this video, please do tell me down in the comments below. I would love to hear from you if you have read any of the books I talked to you about. And what are some of your reading highlights so far? What are some of the fun or not so fun books that you've read in April? Please also do tell me about those in the comments down below. As always, thank you so much for watching. You can follow me on Goodreads and or Storygraph if you want to see what I'm reading, what I'm up to, what are some of my reading updates are. And you can also follow me on Letterboxd if you want to see what I'm watching. That's it for now. Just a quick preview as to what I'm currently reading. I'm currently reading Red Rising, which is the next book for our Reading Popular TikTok books to see if they're any good series. I'm like 1/3 through the book. Spoiler, not having all too much fun with that, but we'll see where that's going. And the other book I'm currently reading is this one, a book about asexuality, Ace, what asexuality reveals about desire, society, and the meaning of sex. A book I've been very excited about reading. You can already see I tabbed a bunch of stuff. I'm a bit more than halfway through now. Really excited to get back into, through this. So you're probably going to hear about this in the next reading wrap-up. So that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done it already. And I'll see all of you very soon. Goodbye.